Osteoporosis is a diagnosis that will strike fear in the heart of most people that receive the diagnosis and oftentimes their friends and family members. The problem with this is that whenever something takes center stage in someone's mind, it's easy for us to forget about other things that matter. When I see people work on osteoporosis, particularly on their own, and sometimes even with their doctors, I find oftentimes that they will forget about the other common causes of death and disability. That includes heart disease, stroke, dementia, specifically Alzheimer's, diabetes, metabolic health, and the list goes on and on. What I see happening often in the bone health space is that people will find a treatment plan for osteoporosis and they will just focus on that thing and forget about everything else. And you've probably heard me talk about how in the traditional medical system, treatment for osteoporosis is myopic. It's very short-sighted. But I think oftentimes we get that way on our own. So what I'm going to talk to you about is why we treat osteoporosis the way that we do, why we get the labs that we get, why we run a 12-month program rather than do consultations. So stick around because I'm going to walk you through this framework of osteoporosis through the lens of health span and how this is likely different than probably any other approach that you've seen. So I recently did a video called, I think, the 4R framework or a proven framework for osteoporosis reversal or something like that. And we'll link to that video. I'm not going to go over that in detail right now because I really want to get through this perspective through HealthSpan. And what happens is, as we go through that 4R framework, the second R is to reverse the causes of bone loss. And this is really where we build our program because the third R is to retest. We build our framework based off of the pyramid of optimization. So the pyramid of optimization is something that we designed for our health optimization program, the OHH program, but we use it in the bone health space because we want to then use that same health span perspective, that longevity, anti-aging health span mindset to then treat osteoporosis. We also do this through our same 12-month model because we can't get enough done in a single consultation. You guys have probably all been to some really great doctors that'll sit down with you for potentially an hour or 2 hours or more, and they'll just give all this information. But how do you put that into play? What do you do with it? And that's really the challenge around treating something like this, because as you'll see as we go through this case, there's so much information. There's so many things to put into play. It really takes a team to do this. And that's why, again, we've kind of stepped away from doing consultations. We've stepped away from anything that isn't our full service program because we want to deliver to our patients exactly what they're going for. And now let me walk you through this health optimization pyramid. So when we create a program, we have to start with the pillars of health. We used to have 4. We kind of expanded it to 6. I'll explain why. Nutrition is clearly important. Exercise is clearly important. Sleep. These last 3 we kind of pulled apart because we needed a way to really define them. So connection, mindset, and spiritual connection or spiritual health. Connection is more you and your community. Mindset is how you view your disease, how you view your progress, how you view your resources. And then spiritual connection is going to be, whether this be you and God, whether this be you and nature, whether this be you and whatever. But we find that even for people that are not interested in religion, they still need some kind of a sense of a greater purpose. Otherwise, they don't really seem motivated to move forward. And you can be an atheist, you can be agnostic, it doesn't matter what it is, but you need to have some kind of connection with something bigger than yourself. And that's that spiritual connection that we're talking about. So then there's the next level, and you guys have probably heard me talk about this. So targeted supplementation, discussion of hormone optimization and replacement, peptides, and then pharmaceuticals, ultimately to achieve our bone health. So that's the health optimization pyramid as it pertains to bone health. Before we get through how we set that up and how we set up a program through that framework, let me just talk about this 12-month program thing, because we get a lot of kickback from people that are interested in working with us, but they don't want to commit to a 12-month program. And I totally get that because honestly, I've looked at programs for myself in the past and I've thought, man, 12 months, that is a huge commitment. Like, I don't know what I'm going to be doing a year from now. But when you look at what we're trying to do, what we're trying to achieve, it takes an approach. Actually, first, I'll take a step back. It takes a lot of information, and then it takes an approach, and then it takes recalibrating, and then it takes another approach. It takes accountability along the way, and the things that we're doing take time. That's why we use coaches, dietitians, because we're working on lifestyle, nutrition, You're tracking food for a period of time and then not, and seeing if you can do it without, and then adding it back. The exercise, progressive overload has to start somewhere and go somewhere. That's the whole point of progressive overload. You need a defined schedule. You need somebody to help you stay on track. You need to track your progress. You need somebody to order the labs, potentially prescribe medications. So doing this in anything less, I think, is going to probably not yield the success that we're seeing. So before I talk to you about this case example, and I actually use this in another video, so I'm going to kind of fly through it, but I want to use this as a case example because in that video, I was just showing this gentleman as an example of success. But I also want to talk about what led him to get there and our lens of HealthSpan and how we changed what would ultimately just be a bone health program to a comprehensive HealthSpan program. But before I get there, if you haven't already and you are finding value in these videos, do me a favor and click that subscribe button. If you want to have an opportunity to ask questions outside of the comments below YouTube, if you want to actually interact with me live, consider signing up for our HealthSpan Network. Our HealthSpan Network is a new program that we're developing at the time of this video recording that I think is going to be very popular because it's going to bring together people that are interested in optimization of health in general, both bone health and optimization. Otherwise, talking about tricks, tactics, a weekly Q&A with either myself or one of my team members, and then access to resources, discount codes, etc. So really excited to bring both of my populations together in the HealthSpan Network. So you can look for a link for that in the description below. All right, so like I said, I've presented this case before, and this is a 62-year-old gentleman who recently retired, and he presented with, mild-ish osteoporosis. It actually looked worse on DEXA than it does on REMS, but these are his REMS reports. And so you can see that he legitimately has osteoporosis. It is mild, but he really wanted to push forward. So let me just walk you through the imaging. This first one is the initial REMS when he started our program. And then now we have a 6-month follow-up REMS. And you can see that already he's gone, 2.6 to 2.4 in his spine, 2.7 to 2.4 in his hip. And then at 12 months, he went from 2.4 to 2.3 and then 2.4 to 2.2. So those numbers don't actually sound like a lot, but if you look at the actual bone mineral density measure, it's actually 11% in his hip and 4% in his spine. And that's pretty incredible. 11% in the hip is a lot to do in 12 months. So that's pretty exciting. If you look at his actual fracture risk, so his fracture risk from the beginning to the end actually went down by 61% in his hip and almost 40% in his spine. So these are the kind of results that we're seeing on a regular basis. I just like demonstrating this case because he had access to a REMS. And so we have really great imaging data, but it just shows how quickly you can see these improvements. And this is a gentleman not using drugs. So then let me walk you through kind of our thought process with this patient. And when he came in, he was really aggressive actually with wanting to know everything and get to the bottom of everything. So we'll talk about that, but let me walk you through kind of the idea behind of what we do. So I've mentioned the frameworks. I wanted to just mention the lab work because this is something that people ask all the time when they see our list of labs. They sort of say, "Wow, that's a lot of blood work," and it is. But the reason why we do that is because we want to not just look at bone health. We want to look at adrenal health. We want to look at your kidney function. We want to look at liver enzymes. We want to look at your iron stores. We want to look at dementia biomarkers, cardiovascular biomarkers. We want to look at nutrient status. We want to look at all of these things, not because they're all directly related to your bones, but they are all indirectly related to your bones because they're all part of your body. But we shouldn't focus on just one organ system. We really need to focus on the big picture. And that's what I mean when I say, let's look at this through the lens of HealthSpan. And another issue with this is that if you don't take everything into account, a lot of times I see people that have set up kind of a program for themselves as they come in, and I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, gosh, like some of these things are aimed at one goal, some of these are aimed at another, but the modalities are actually contradicting each other. So I'll see people that'll come in on like these really fancy protocols of peptides and hormones, and some are going to be trying to lose weight and body comp, and then the others are actually trying to like gain weight and build muscle. And I'm thinking, like you're sending your body such mixed signals right now. Let's take a step back and let's actually identify what our clear goals are. Understanding what these other things are for, but let's create a clear goal, because oftentimes preventing heart disease, dementia, and osteoporosis are actually very similar. A lot of times those are very similar and compatible goals. But weight loss, metabolic health, often not, because you're looking at anabolic versus catabolic. And so we really need to understand what our goals are in order to create a comprehensive plan that makes sense. Okay, so I'm going to present this patient. When he came to us, he was 61 and he had just gone through a weight loss journey. He wanted to really take back his health. And so he wanted to do a lot of things. He wanted to maintain his weight loss. He wanted to look deeper into some liver dysfunction and a diagnosis of fatty liver that he had. He was concerned that he went from osteopenia to osteoporosis over a relatively short time period. It felt like he was probably in trouble there. He also had high cholesterol. He was worried about heart disease. He had gut dysfunction. He had a diagnosis of GERD. He was on a PPI. He was on a beta blocker for his blood pressure. He had an enlarged prostate. He was on Cialis for his prostate, more so than any kind of sexual benefit, but was already on this drug. Didn't know if he should keep taking it, was worried about that. And he was a pretty active guy, but not doing what he needed to do, in my opinion. So what do? Well, we look at everything as a patient comes in and we decide what we need to test. Now, everybody in our program gets the blood biomarker, so that's not an issue. Most people will get out of the gate a functional test. A lot of times we're testing gut function, and we do that through a stool test for most people out of the gate. This gentleman wanted to do more. He wanted to really dig into some of these things because he'd been tired of having gut dysfunction. He wanted to know what to eat. So we went through a lot of different things. So I'm going to show you this functional testing out of the gate. And I think this is a really fun example of some of the stuff that you can do through functional testing if it's indicated. And for this patient, we felt like this was a reasonable thing to do. Not everybody does this out of the gate. Sometimes we do one, sometimes we do none. But let me just walk you through this because I think it's really fun. So the first one that we're going to do is his ZRT, which is the company that makes it, diurnal cortisol. So the diurnal cortisol is a saliva test. So you spit into a tube 4 times throughout the day, and it will show you the breakdown products of cortisol, or the stress hormone that's coming from your adrenal glands. Now, we also test cortisol in serum, in blood, but it's nice to know this because, as you can see for this patient, and I don't have his serum markers here, but I can tell you that it was normal. So what we see in this breakdown is that, and I can just orient you here, so you want your black dots to be on the green line. Anything one red line above or below is a standard deviation. That's a statistical measure, meaning that most people are kind of within one standard deviation. So you should be within the 2 red lines, ideally on the green line. If it's high, it's high. If it's low, it's low. And so throughout the day, you should have this normal, what's called diurnal cortisol pattern. And if the black dots are above the green line, that means your adrenal glands are making too much. If it falls below, or if it doesn't make any, that means you're not making any. And so what we see here is that he's making a lot in the morning. And so we talked about stress for him. And then if you watch throughout the day, it kind of dropped off nicely, but then it comes back up in the afternoon and then it drops back off. And so what this tells me is that we're seeing excess cortisol production. We probably should do something about his cortisol production and potentially help to calm down his adrenal glands. So we have a recommendation for that. Okay, so with that cortisol testing, what we're really trying to do is to figure out how hard do we need to push on the fundamental side. How hard do we need to help him with stress mitigation? And that can be a challenging thing that can take a lot of time. So when somebody has high cortisol, we're talking about, okay, how do you take time for yourself? Do you need to utilize activities like meditation, mindfulness, journaling, whatever it takes to get somebody to find that time to help to bring the cortisol down. So this next test we're going to look at is a gut test. So this is gut function test. This is a stool test, which again, we do a lot because we see so much gut dysfunction leading to osteoporosis. So in this case, for example, this is somebody who actually doesn't have a lot of dysfunction from a maldigestion perspective or not having enough enzymes. In fact, his enzymes look fantastic. So he's breaking down food, but he actually has an issue where he has an imbalance of the metabolites. So as things are being broken down, what the bacteria need, what they don't need, and also he has some evidence of some infection. So this is something where we were able to treat the infection. We worked from a dietary perspective to improve the metabolites, and then this was actually a pretty easy one. Now, a lot of times we'll stop there with functional testing, but again, this patient really wanted to go all in and figure out, answer some questions around, what he should eat and shouldn't eat, and he just had been, he'd been chasing his tail long enough with this thing. He really wanted some answers, so we did some additional testing. So what you see here is this thing called a Zoomer from a company called Vibrant Wellness, one of the functional medicine companies that we use. And the Zoomers are really interesting because you have probably heard of, if you've been in this space at all, you've probably heard of things like food sensitivity testing. And we have one of those. The thing about food sensitivity testing you have to be careful of is that when you're looking at foods, whole foods, when you're looking at specifically things like IgG or this subtle autoimmunity or memory autoimmunity that IgG is, it can actually not really tell you what you think it tells you or what you want it to tell you, which is, do I need to avoid this food or not? A lot of times with IgG food sensitivity testing, you're looking at, did my immune system ever have an exposure to this thing? And a lot of times the answer would be, yeah, at some point your immune system saw it, but it's not an issue now. And so I think you can get a lot of bad information that way. The Zoomers are different. So the Zoomers will look at both IgG and IgM, which is a shorter time frame of how long it's been since your immune system has seen it. And it's to the specific proteins within some of these bigger food items. So we do a wheat Zoomer from Virant because it gives us a Zoomer score for wheat itself, and I'll explain that in a minute, but also intestinal permeability, or this concept of leaky gut. And you can see that this patient had both a significant response to wheat, although interestingly not gluten, but also had a pretty significantly leaky gut. So we knew we had some gut work to do. So then the intestinal permeability proteins that it's looking at, these things called zonulin, actin, these are things that he was high on. And this, you could dive into this thing and learn that it tells you exactly what's wrong with the gut permeability, et cetera. But the big picture here is that there is gut permeability and that we needed to do that. The next test is this non-gluten sensitivity, and we see things that are positive like gliadin, glutenin, and these are other proteins that are in wheat that he can't tolerate. So even though he doesn't have a gluten intolerance, doesn't have celiac disease, he still should not consume wheat. And then we see the same thing can be done from a dairy perspective. And they have all kinds of different tests like this, but these are the ones that we do frequently. And so his dairy one is interesting because if you look at this, if you look at dairy and then IgE, which is another antibody, for milk, you can see that he doesn't respond to it. But yet when we start looking at some of the breakdown products like casein, there's, you've probably heard me talk about A1 and A2. So this is where you can look at A1 and A2 and you can say, oh, well, he responds a little bit, but not that much. Should we restrict it or not? Well, we can look at more. So casein breaks down, or A1 at least, breaks down into beta-casomorphine. And again, we're looking at IgA and IgG, and you can see that he has a little bit of response to beta-casomorphine, and then also to lactoferrin, which is another protein in milk. And so you kind of like put all these things together and you say, gosh, I think that you probably should avoid cow dairy, but what about other types of dairy? Or what about A2? And this is where there's another test called a mammalian dairy Zoomer, which will actually give you some information on these other types of dairy. So you can see listed here as goat, sheep, camel, and donkey. Now, I don't know how to get camel or donkey milk, but goat and sheep are pretty prevalently available, and you can see that he actually does tolerate these. So he can consume particularly some goat and some sheep milk. He probably could consume A2 cow, and then also there's some questions that we have about raw dairy, which I'll talk about someday. And then another thing that we tested for him are lectins. And so lectins, you've probably heard me talk about in the anti-nutrients video, which is really controversial. But lectins are these things that do exist. They can really bother a lot of people, but they're testable, right? And you can also prepare foods to eliminate them. So we tested his, and it looks like really, so tomatoes, probably he should avoid, maybe lentils, and then mung bean. I always see mung bean high. I don't know what that's a cross reactivity with, but whatever, mung bean. And so he should probably avoid these things like lentils and tomatoes. And so he kind of took that to heart and with his dietary approach. And then there's the genetics. So now in the genetic space, there's a whole lot of SNPs that we get, and SNP stands for single nucleotide polymorphism. I should do a video on that someday. But basically, we're looking for these little differences that can help us to make recommendations on how you should eat or live your life, supplements, etc. This is a really important one. So for him, he has a saturated fat response, which is pretty good. So it means he doesn't need to avoid saturated fat. And he has an ApoE status of 3.3. So what does that mean? That means that his genetic profile supports using dietary fat of saturated fat content. So he's not intolerant to saturated fat. So this is great because then we can say, well, he would actually benefit from probably things more like red meat, higher saturated fat products like a ribeye, or these higher fat items, pork that are hopefully pasture raised. And so we don't necessarily need to restrict his saturated fat, and he's not going to have an inflammatory response as a result of that. So that's also really helpful to know. So what do we do? Well, again, if we were to just treat his bones, you could see how we could make a lot of mistakes in this process, because a regimented approach that's just aimed at building bones would actually miss a lot of these things that we just talked about. So with him, we go back to these foundational nutrition pillars, or all the pillars of the foundational pillars, nutrition being the first one. And we kind of talked about, these are all the things that he should avoid, but then we talk about the things that he should include. And so as I've talked about multiple times, this is a protein forward from animal protein, with the appropriate vegetables and non-starchy veggies and fruits, and then adding in other things as needed. But for the most part, that's what he eats, and he loves his diet. Exercise, we made some shifts. He did find that he was close enough to do some OsteoStrong work, and then he was also adding in some additional resistance training and some other outdoor activities to really round out his kind of longevity approach to exercise. We did work with him a little bit on stress mitigation, but he was newly retired, so I think that by itself is probably going to fix this problem. He was really working on connection with his family, with his spouse, other ways that he could connect in his community. I think that'll really help him. And then we had a nice little conversation about spiritual health, and he didn't need any help from my perspective on that. And then we started with the custom supplement plan. And so the nice thing about looking at it this way is that we can really address all of his concerns. So like we added choline for liver health, and to continue to help him to clean out his fatty liver, which his diet is doing anyway, but he needed some assistance in purging that out. We added things like bergamot to help bring down his ApoB, to improve with his cardiovascular risk. And they recommended some additional imaging and testing there. The complete supplement plan included things for his bones too, but we wanted to hit all of his biggest concerns, and that's the health span approach. Reviewing his medications, talking about, does he need or not need a statin? Tadalafil, or Cialis, as it turns out, is actually a really great drug to take on a daily basis from a longevity perspective, reduces your risk of dementia, and has a side effect of improved prostate function and erectile function. So that's a really fun drug that he was happy to learn about those side effects. He didn't actually need hormone replacement. His testosterone was pretty good. He was able to let go of his metoprolol. We were able to increase his gut function and get him off of his PPI. And then we talked about peptides for other aspects of his health. And we used things like AOD 9604, BPC 157, MOTS-C, and just kind of cycle these things through just to help to continue with all of his function. And we addressed basically all of his concerns, right? Including his bone health. So this is this whole concept of bone health through the lens of health span. If I just fix your bones and you develop dementia or you have a heart attack, then we didn't do you any good. I want to help address the fear associated with all of these chronic diseases and help you to understand that, yes, you have this one disease, but let's look at the big picture so that we don't get myopic in our view and do the same thing that we complain about in the traditional medical system, but in our integrative functional medicine health optimization space. We have to maintain that 30,000-foot view to make sure that we're seeing everything that we need to see. So that was a lot. Sorry if that drug on, but you can see why it is required for us to bring people in under the roof to do this kind of a program. And if you're working with somebody, I would encourage you to have them to take a look at this video, have them explain to you how they are doing this through the lens of health span and being comprehensive. I think there are a lot of different ways to do this, but you have to include a lot of these things in order to see the improvements like we're seeing them. So I hope you found this helpful. If you haven't already, go ahead and click that subscribe button. I really appreciate your support. If you haven't downloaded our free ebook, I have it right here. So short book, easy read. You can download the free ebook from the website that we can link to in the description below, or you can buy it on Amazon for around $10. Again, short book, easy read. Strongly encourage people to do that. If you want to be able to ask us questions live, consider joining our HealthSpan Nation. And again, that link will be in the description below as well. That's where you're going to join me and my optimization patients, and you're going to be able to hear us talk about other ways that we can optimize our health, improve our health span, and help us to live better longer. So that's it for today. Thanks for making it to the end of this video, and I will see you next time.